When people imagine wealthy lifestyles, they often picture expensive cars, luxury watches, and extravagant houses. The assumption is that having more money simply means buying more things. But when researchers began studying the daily habits of financially successful individuals, they discovered something surprising. Many wealthy people are actually far more selective about what they spend money on. In fact, some of the purchases that middle-class households make regularly are the exact things many financially stable people tend to avoid. It's not because they can't afford them. It's because they understand something important about how spending habits shape long-term wealth. Sometimes the difference between staying financially comfortable and constantly feeling stretched comes down to a handful of everyday decisions. And once you start noticing those decisions, the pattern becomes surprisingly clear. There's a version of wealth most people have been sold. It lives in advertisements, in social media feeds, in the background of music videos. It looks like champagne and sports cars and watches that cost more than a year's salary. And because that image is so persistent, so thoroughly woven into the visual language of success, many people begin to assume that spending lavishly is simply what wealthy people do. That money, once you have enough of it, naturally flows outward in spectacular ways. But in 1996, two researchers quietly dismantled that assumption with data. Thomas Stanley and William Danko spent years interviewing and surveying over 1,000 American millionaires, not celebrities, not inherited billionaires, but self-made, quietly wealthy individuals across the country. What they found became the foundation of a book called The Millionaire Next Door, and the findings were almost startling in how ordinary they were. The majority of these millionaires lived in modest neighborhoods. They drove used or mid-range cars. They shopped at ordinary grocery stores. They didn't look the part. And that, Stanley and Danko argued, was precisely the point. The wealth was invisible because it hadn't been spent. Stanley introduced a distinction that cuts right to the heart of this. He separated people into two groups, prodigious accumulators of wealth, and underaccumulators of wealth. The difference wasn't income. Some of the underaccumulators earned impressive salaries. The difference was what happened to that money after it arrived. Underaccumulators spent heavily on things that signaled success to the people around them. Prodigious accumulators spent carefully, avoided status purchases, and let the money compound quietly in the background. Morgan Housel, in his 2020 book The Psychology of Money, frames it differently but arrives at the same place. He writes that wealth is what you don't see. The car parked in the driveway, the watch on someone's wrist, the designer bag, these are all evidence of money that has already been exchanged for something. The actual wealth, the retained assets, the compounding investments, the financial cushion, none of that is visible. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't generate likes. But it is, Housel argues, the thing that actually matters. This isn't a lecture about deprivation. It isn't a call to stop enjoying life. It's something more specific than that. It's an observation about patterns, about the kinds of purchases that quietly drain financial stability without anyone noticing, and why people who have built lasting wealth tend to look at those purchases very differently. The first pattern that shows up consistently in research on millionaire spending habits involves cars. Not transportation in general, just the specific decision of how to acquire a vehicle, and what kind. Stanley's data found that the most common car driven by American millionaires wasn't a Mercedes or a BMW. It was a Toyota. Not because wealthy people have no taste, but because they've run the numbers and understand what a car actually does to your finances over time. A new vehicle loses roughly 15 to 20% of its value the moment it leaves the dealership lot. Within the first 3 years, that depreciation climbs toward 50% for many models. So the person who finances a brand new luxury car, convinced they're treating themselves to something they've earned, is actually watching thousands of dollars evaporate before they've even made the first monthly payment. And the monthly payment itself, often stretched over 6 or 7 years on a premium vehicle, creates a long, low-grade financial drag that rarely appears in the mental calculation people make when they fall in love with a car on a lot. Wealthy individuals, particularly self-made ones, tend to buy vehicles that are 2 to 3 years old, already past the steepest depreciation cliff, and often sold by original owners who took care of them. They get most of the reliability with a fraction of the loss. The car still gets them where they're going. The difference is that several $1,000s stayed in their account instead of vaporizing at the dealership. The second pattern is closely related and involves what happens right after you agree to buy something, that moment at the register, or at the end of a contract signing, when someone offers you a little extra protection. Extended warranties. Coverage add-ons. Service plans with names that sound reassuring. These products are almost universally poor financial value, and wealthy individuals with strong financial literacy tend to decline them without much hesitation. The reason extended warranties exist, and the reason they're pushed so aggressively at the point of sale, is that they are extraordinarily profitable for the seller. The markup on a warranty product is often 2 to 3 times its actuarial value, meaning the risk being covered costs far less than the price being charged. Warren Buffett has spoken at length about the insurance industry's profitability being rooted in human psychology, specifically the tendency to overvalue peace of mind. Financially stable people tend to self-insure against small risks. They keep a modest emergency fund precisely so that a broken appliance or a minor car repair doesn't require a separate product purchased months in advance at a premium price. The third pattern involves something so mundane it almost feels unworthy of mention, but the data is consistent enough that it deserves its place here. It's the grocery store. Specifically, the quiet, habitual choice between brand name products and their generic equivalents. Multiple surveys of high-net-worth individuals, including research compiled by CNBC and Fidelity, have found that self-made millionaires regularly choose store brand or generic products for household consumables. Cleaning supplies, canned goods, medications, pantry staples. The quality difference, for most of these items, is negligible or non-existent. The price difference, accumulated across a year of regular shopping, is substantial. What's interesting about this pattern isn't the dollar figure. It's what it reveals about the relationship these people have with status and spending. Brand-name grocery items are partly purchased as a form of self-signaling, a small, daily affirmation of a certain lifestyle. Financially secure individuals don't need that signal. They've already resolved the question of who they are. The cereal doesn't have to do any work. The fourth item on this list is one that behavioral economists have studied with particular interest because it reveals so much about how people understand probability. Lottery tickets. The lottery is a legal, socially accepted way to lose money at a mathematically predictable rate, and research published in journals on behavioral decision-making consistently shows that lottery ticket purchases are heavily concentrated in lower-income households. Wealthy individuals, almost universally, don't play. Not because they're too proud, but because they understand expected value. The simple calculation that a $2 ticket with a 1 in 10 million chance of winning represents a catastrophically bad financial exchange, regardless of the jackpot size. This isn't about moralizing. It's about noticing what the behavior reveals. The lottery is appealing because it offers a story, the sudden transformation, the solved problem, the single moment that changes everything. Financially stable people tend not to be drawn to that narrative because they've replaced it with a different one. Slow, boring, methodical accumulation. It doesn't make for a compelling fantasy, but it works. The fifth pattern involves a product category that has generated enormous amounts of regret and remarkably little wealth: timeshares. The timeshare industry has been studied extensively by consumer advocates, and the findings are consistent. Resale values for timeshares collapse almost immediately after purchase. Secondary market listings regularly appear at $1, not as a figure of speech, but as a literal asking price, because the ongoing maintenance fees make the underlying property a liability rather than an asset. The American Resort Development Association's own data acknowledges that a significant percentage of timeshare buyers attempt to exit their contracts within the first year. Financially literate individuals, when they evaluate a timeshare presentation, run a simple calculation. They compare the total cost, purchase price, annual maintenance fees, financing charges, against the cost of simply renting equivalent accommodation whenever they want it. The math almost never favors the timeshare. Wealthy people tend to see this clearly. They take the vacation and pay for it directly, without locking themselves into a decade-long financial obligation dressed up as a lifestyle purchase. The sixth pattern moves into something more personal, and perhaps more recognizable. Clothing. Specifically, the habit of buying trendy items frequently, fast fashion, seasonal refreshes, purchases driven by what's current rather than what's durable or genuinely needed. Research on millionaire wardrobes, explored in detail by Thomas Stanley and later updated by his daughter Sarah Stanley Falla in the next Millionaire Next Door, consistently shows that wealthy individuals buy fewer clothing items overall but spend more per item on quality. They wear things longer. They're less likely to discard something because it's fallen out of fashion. This runs directly counter to the clothing industry's business model, which profits enormously from the cycle of novelty, perceived obsolescence, and replacement. The psychological mechanism at work is straightforward. Clothing, like cars, can function as a status signal, a way of communicating identity and aspiration to the people around you. People who feel financially insecure or socially uncertain are more susceptible to this. People who have resolved those questions tend to buy a good jacket and wear it for 10 years. The seventh pattern is one that Morgan Housel addresses carefully in The Psychology of Money, because it's been the subject of a famous and somewhat tedious cultural debate. Daily convenience purchases, the expensive coffee, the delivery fee, the convenience store markup, the small frictions of modern life that we pay to eliminate. Housel is clear that no single latte is responsible for anyone's financial situation. That framing is reductive and slightly condescending. But the underlying observation he's making is worth separating from the cliché. The issue isn't the purchase itself. It's the habit of not noticing costs when they're small and frequent. Financially stable people tend to be attentive to the full picture of where their money goes, not obsessively, but systematically. They know roughly what they spend and on what. They don't have large categories of spending that operate on autopilot, invisible and unexamined. The coffee isn't the problem. The inattention the coffee represents, the broader willingness to let convenience costs accumulate without scrutiny, that's the pattern worth examining. The eighth item follows directly from that observation and has become significantly more relevant in the last decade. Subscription services. Not any particular subscription, but the accumulated weight of recurring charges that most households carry without fully accounting for. A 2022 survey by West Monroe Partners found that the average American significantly underestimates their monthly subscription spending, in many cases by more than double. Streaming platforms, software tools, apps, membership programs, cloud storage, news subscriptions, fitness services. Each one, individually, seems reasonable. Together, they can easily represent several $100s a month that never gets actively chosen, just passively tolerated. Behavioral economist Richard Thaler's research on mental accounting helps explain why this happens. Active purchases feel like real spending decisions. Recurring charges, once established, move into a different mental category. They become part of the background, as invisible as a utility bill. Financially organized individuals audit this regularly. They cancel what they don't use. They treat recurring costs with the same scrutiny they'd apply to a one-time purchase of the same annual value. It's a small discipline, but the numbers add up. The ninth pattern involves technology, and it runs against the image most people have of successful, forward-thinking people rushing to get the newest device. Research on early adoption consistently shows that the people most likely to wait in line for a phone on release day, or pre-order a gadget months before it ships, are motivated primarily by status and novelty rather than utility. Wealthy individuals, particularly those who have built financial stability through patient, long-term thinking, tend to be late adopters of consumer technology. They wait for the price to drop, which it reliably does. They wait for real-world reviews to separate genuine improvements from marketing claims. They replace devices when the existing one stops serving their needs, not when a newer model creates the social pressure to upgrade. This isn't technophobia. It's the application of the same patient, deliberate thinking that governs their other financial decisions, the recognition that time smooths out most of the premium attached to being first. The 10th pattern is about entertainment, and specifically about the gap between what people pay for and what they actually consume. Premium cable packages. Bloated streaming bundles. Entertainment subscriptions assembled optimistically, based on an imagined future of leisurely viewing, rather than an honest accounting of actual habits. Research on media consumption consistently shows that households use only a fraction of their subscribed content. The average cable package contains hundreds of channels. The average household watches a small handful regularly. Financially aware individuals match what they pay for to what they actually use. This sounds obvious, but it requires a specific kind of honesty, the willingness to look at a subscription not as a potential, as something you might use, but as a current reality, as something you do use. The potential is always appealing. The actual usage is usually much narrower. Wealthy people tend to pay for what they watch rather than what they imagine they might someday watch. The 11th pattern involves health and fitness, which is a category where the gap between intention and behavior is probably more expensive than any other. Gym memberships that go unused for 11 months of the year. Exercise equipment that becomes an expensive shelf or clothing rack within weeks of arrival. Fitness programs purchased in January with genuine enthusiasm and abandoned by March. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Health Economics found that gym members who overestimate how often they'll attend pay a significant annual premium over what they would pay on a per-visit basis, essentially a tax on optimism. Financially rational individuals are more precise about matching purchase to actual behavior. If they genuinely exercise regularly and value a gym, they pay for it without guilt. If they don't buy the membership hoping the sunk cost will motivate them. This is a small example of a broader discipline, spending based on honest self-knowledge rather than idealized self-image. It saves money and tends to reduce the low-grade guilt of unused purchases sitting in the background. The 12th pattern is perhaps the most structurally important of all the items on this list, because it doesn't just drain money, it actively multiplies the cost of everything else. High-interest consumer debt instruments. Buy now pay later schemes for non-essential purchases. Retail store credit cards with APRs that climb above 20%. Payday loans. Revolving credit card balances carried month to month on lifestyle spending. Federal Reserve data on household debt consistently shows that high-net-worth individuals carry far lower revolving credit balances relative to income than lower-wealth households at equivalent income levels. This matters because debt doesn't just cost the amount borrowed. It costs the amount borrowed, plus the interest, plus the compounding effect of what that money would have become if it hadn't been spent. Wealthy individuals understand compounding in both directions. They know what it does for them when it works in their favor through investments. And they know what it does against them when it works against them through debt. Financing a lifestyle through high-interest instruments is, in a very literal mathematical sense, the opposite of building wealth. The purchases arrive immediately. The payment continues long after the enjoyment has faded. Looking at these 12 patterns together, something becomes visible that isn't obvious when you examine each item individually. This isn't really about frugality in the traditional sense. It isn't about sacrifice, or about living an impoverished life in pursuit of a number on a spreadsheet. It's about something more psychological, a particular relationship with spending that tends to develop in people who have thought carefully about what money is actually for. Sarah Stanley Fallaw's research in the next Millionaire Next Door introduced a concept she called economic outpatient care, the quiet financial support that flows between generations, and the way it shapes spending behavior. But her broader finding was about what she called hyperconsumption, the degree to which people are influenced by advertising, by social comparison, by the desire to signal status through purchases. Self-made wealthy individuals, her data showed, scored consistently lower on hyperconsumption scales. Not because they had more willpower as individuals, but because they had developed a different framework for evaluating what a purchase was actually worth. Robert Frank, in his book Luxury Fever, documented what he called the expenditure cascade, the way that visible high spending by upper-income households creates a ripple effect downward, pressuring middle-income households to upgrade their own spending in response. You see a nicer car in the neighborhood, so the old car starts to look inadequate. A colleague renovates their kitchen, so yours starts to feel dated. The spending happens not because anyone needed anything, but because the social reference point shifted. Financially stable people are, in a measurable sense, less susceptible to this cascade. They've established enough internal clarity about what they value that the external reference point has less power over them. This is what Housel means when he talks about defining enough. Most financial conversations are framed around the question of how to get more. The more interesting question, the one that seems to occupy genuinely wealthy people with more frequency, is how much is actually enough. Enough to be comfortable. Enough to feel secure. Enough to stop needing purchases to do psychological work that they were never designed to do. Once that number is defined, the pressure to keep spending in response to external signals begins to ease. Kahneman and Tversky's research on loss aversion adds another layer to this. Humans are wired to feel losses more acutely than equivalent gains. Wealthy individuals who have accumulated assets tend to feel this asymmetry sharply when they think about spending decisions. A purchase that loses value quickly, or provides only temporary satisfaction, registers not just as a neutral exchange but as a small loss, money that was there and is now gone. This sensitivity isn't anxiety. It's a kind of financial attention that develops over years of deliberate thinking about where money goes and what it does when it gets there. There's a final observation worth sitting with. The purchases on this list aren't bad things. Cars are useful. Warranties feel reassuring. Gym memberships represent genuine aspirations. New technology is often genuinely exciting. None of these things are wrong to want. What the research reveals is something more subtle, that the relationship a person has with these purchases, the psychological work they're being asked to do, is often the real issue. When a car purchase is partly about proving something to the neighborhood, the car costs more than its sticker price. When a wardrobe refresh is partly about managing anxiety through the brief pleasure of something new, the clothes cost more than the receipt shows. When a lottery ticket is partly about buying a few days of imagining a different life, the ticket costs more than $2. The actual financial drain is secondary to the underlying need that the purchase is trying to address. Wealthy people, in the aggregate, seem to have found other ways to address those needs, or to simply need less from their purchases. Their financial stability provides a kind of cushion that makes status signaling less urgent. Their clear sense of long-term goals makes short-term gratification less appealing. Their comfort with delayed outcomes makes patience feel less like deprivation and more like ordinary life. Ronald Read, the Vermont janitor that Morgan Housel wrote about, died at 92 with an $8 million estate. He never earned a significant salary. He never made a spectacular investment. He simply spent far less than he earned for decades, invested what remained in simple, reliable ways, and let time do its work. His story is striking not because it's aspirational in a dramatic sense, but because it removes all the complexity from the question. He didn't need a formula or a strategy. He needed, more than anything, to not spend money on things that didn't matter to him. That's the thread that runs through all 12 of these patterns. Not deprivation. Not discipline in the punishing sense of the word. Just a quiet, consistent clarity about what a purchase is actually buying, what it's providing, what it's costing, and whether the exchange is one worth making. The financially stable people who tend to avoid these purchases aren't more virtuous than everyone else. They've just had the chance, or taken the chance, to think carefully about these questions before the moment of purchase rather than after. And the interesting thing about that kind of clarity is that it's not attached to an income level. It doesn't require being wealthy to adopt it. It requires only the willingness to look at spending the way that wealthy people quietly look at it, not as an expression of who you are, but as a decision about who you're becoming.